First question is, just share with the audience, what is the current state of the gaming industry now, and why is it such a rich channel for advertisers, particularly those looking to connect with customers in a social environment?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's something to be said about, certainly throughout the pandemic and what have you, there was a lot of interest that was heightened in the gaming sector more generally. Some of it just due to the fact that, again, when we were all kind of in lockdown, we were looking for means to be able to connect without the needing physicality, and certainly that's always been one of gaming's superpowers, right? So on the one hand, even folks that had not been interested in gaming or hadn't gamed in a long time, they were coming back to it. Now, as we're getting out of that, and we're kind of getting to a point of some degree of social normalcy, now we're heading into economic abnormality. And along with that, we found that, some of those initial boosts in the gaming sector have kind of come down, but on the whole, it's still growing. And what we found is that many consumers that re-picked up hobbies in gaming and what have you have kept that even out from the pandemic. So we're at an interesting point where I think marketer attention was kind of captured. And again, that has to do with the pandemic. It could be, again, we just heard about the metaverse and kind of speculative interest in that. Been shifting from just kind of understanding it at a base level to more kind of understanding how are consumers oriented around it, inclusive of things like social behaviors and how they actually look for connectivity and what are the values that they're looking to fulfill through this channel, because we're in a bit of a mode where we need to catch up and start to understand a medium like gaming the same way that we understand social or film or television or what have you.
I saw an interesting stat recently, and it's been reported around that gaming actually out-earned Hollywood. That was one of the headlines last year, so it was bigger than Hollywood. Strange that is conceived of that notion. Could you just talk a little bit about that? And is that primarily because of the pandemic lockdown and people, like you said, started getting into more gaming, they started being around, and is it continuing on the trend? That's the question.
Yeah, actually it's been bigger than the box office for several years now. So that was pre-pandemic. I think latest number I saw is that the overall sector is going to eclipse probably 200 billion. So all told, it's bigger than the box office and music, and the box office and music combined. So I think that's one of these things that, folks that, again, aren't particularly familiar with the sector, they recognize that, sure, a lot of people do it. Sure, a lot of people are paying increasing amounts of attention. But realistically, it's been a big industry, throughout this entire time. And yes, attention was kind of focused during the pandemic. But, what I tell folks is, it's been up and to the right for quite some time. We saw, again, a little bit of an acceleration, but that hasn't been the only source of growth. That's just been an acceleration at a certain point of a continued growth trajectory.
Well, give us a closer look at the audience. So we'd like to know that how do audiences interact with gaming, especially as it relates to other media? So, for example, like linear TV or streaming.
Yeah, I mean, so I think true to form, again, when we were talking about, in the previous panel, like Roblox and what have you, there's really kind of this focus on Gen Z, Gen Alpha, older folks in that manner. But, the thing to understand is that where we find that most folks are spending the greatest amount of time in gaming is folks that have grown up gaming. And again, if you look at the history of gaming, which goes back 40 or 50 years, that's not just Gen Z, that's not just Gen Alpha, that's millennials, that's Gen X, right? So you have folks that have ostensibly grown up with gaming and that are now 40 years old, right? They got a bad knee, they got a mortgage, they got all these things kind of working against them. So, in what we found then is that, for folks that are even in, kind of that prime household shopping demo, over 75% of them are actually gaming on a weekly basis, and then it gets near ubiquity as you go younger. So on the one hand, I think it's become kind of popular and in vogue to say that everyone's a gamer, and yeah, kind of. We're really kind of getting to where that's going to be more or less true. And that moreover, what we found is that, when we talk about gaming, I think it's important to recognize that, yes, it's a medium that's become popular, but I also tend to level set with folks. It represents kind of just this fundamental reorganization of how we have a relationship with media more generally. And by that, what I mean is, if you look at trends of how folks consume media, particularly for younger versus older cohorts, that whole concept of prime time is going away, right? So we could talk a lot about linear television, the fall of that, and what have you, but realistically, younger generations, and again, to be clear, we're not just talking about Gen Z or whatnot, even millennials, they're now kind of consuming media throughout the day. That concept of prime time is slowly going away. Gaming has also kind of adjusted to that whether you look at mobile phones, portable devices, cloud technologies, things like quick save technologies on consoles, really allowing folks to kind of dip in and out of it throughout the day, because we, like any other media provider, want to make sure that we kind of understand how folks want to consume that media and make sure that's as convenient as possible such that they can continue to consume it on their terms. So if you look at, in particular, how younger folks are consuming media, like short-form video or what have you, they're doing so at about equal levels of gaming at about equal parts throughout the day because we allow them to kind of come into these experiences in a similar manner.
All right, now, to go back to the social connection here, the social aspect of it, you've recently released some research on how gaming drives social connection. So what were some of the biggest takeaways from that?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a few. So, I mean, one, to state the obvious from the get-go, like, since gaming was a thing, it's always been a social activity, right? Like, even back to ancient times, pre-video games, like, games are things that you tend to play with other people. And indeed, when we look at the prevalence of social behaviors in gaming, it's the vast majority of folks that do so. What was particularly interesting, and I think meaningful for marketers in particular, is that when we look at the mechanisms or the mediums through which consumers like to connect with friends and family, what we found is that amongst those that play games, and to be clear, this isn't just people on PCs or consoles or what have you, it includes mobile phones or whatnot, so it's a very large population, gaming was one of the top ways that they sought to connect with friends and family. Only things like calls and text were higher. So to be clear, gaming was more important to them for connecting with friends and family than things like social media. So again, back to that point when I'm talking about this is more or less kind of a fundamental shift in behaviors, that's where a lot of that tends to come from, is that we're looking at that, even aside from media consumption, even how we're interrelating to folks is increasingly influenced by the medium.
I love that stat. I mean, other than calls and texting, that's how close friends and families would communicate with each other, was through gaming.
Yeah, and I mean, like we kind of figured that might be the case, but it's also important to recognize that, this has grown obviously more prevalent due to the fact of like internet connectivity and what have you, that like online gaming and whatnot, I think that's what we think about when we talk about socialization and gaming. But even for games that are inherently solo endeavors, one, there's a lot of folks that still play kind of couch co-op, right? Like you're sitting next to your friend or your significant other or what have you. But then also communities form around these games. So if you think about something like Candy Crush, which is of course like an experience that you play on your own, there are actual communities that exist, thousands of people within them that are all talking about the game, right? So they're all kind of socializing around like strategies and what have you about the game. So what we find is that, whether or not it's a multiplayer experience, whether or not there's even the capability to play directly in the game environment with someone else, it's almost always a social experience. So we focused here because I think, as you noted at the top, when we are looking at gaming and marketers are trying to orient themselves towards it, like, again, you might not be as familiar with this sector, but you probably are with things like social. And what that means is that a lot of those same lessons that we think about in social in terms of halo effects and connectivity and what have you, some of that applies. Because again, gaming isn't necessarily social media, but it is a very social medium.
So how are they actually communicating, though? I mean, they're communicating within the platform itself. So it's almost like a walled garden. Is that the way you're kind of?
Not always. I mean, I would say like even when we talk about marketing experiences, we talk about that there are opportunities in the game, adjacent, and kind of like ancillary to it. And what that means is that sure, you can put marketing experiences in the game, and not all games are going to be right for that. And indeed, some people socialize within them. But when you kind of like telescope out a little bit, adjacent, so things like game streaming and what have you, not necessarily within the game environment, not necessarily gaming per se, but people are then socializing around watching other people play. And then there's kind of that third step even beyond that, like outside communities like fandom or what have you, that again, there's a lot of opportunities, there's a lot of ways to connect with these folks, but also these same consumers are connecting around the gaming experience outside of it. So realistically, as noted, it's kind of at all levels in the same way that when we talk about what these opportunities are, there's multiple different points of ingress, and what makes sense for the brand is going to be, where they want to fit and what type of consumer they're trying to reach.
Right. And there are some misconceptions about who brands can reach and about who they can reach in gaming. What has Activision Blizzard uncovered about gamer profiles?
Yeah, I would say that, I think we're almost at the point, and we have a long-standing joke, that virtually any time that there's been a conversation around gaming audiences and whatnot, particularly with marketers, like this whole concept of like young men in the basement, what have you, is always evoked. And I think we're like almost at the point where we can finally stop talking about that, because I think it's getting fairly well known that, again, yes, there's some truth that if you think about like consoles and younger consumers and what have you, but when we talk about the gaming audience, we're talking about people that have mobile phones with the game on it. So what you'll find is that the split in terms of demographics between like men and women is almost even, and again, really prevalent across all of the age groups. Moreover, and again, like I catch myself doing it a lot, but like when we speak internally and with marketers certainly, we're even trying to step away from that concept of just like gamer in and of itself. When we did typologies of the gaming community, what we found is that, again, for folks that play games, like less than half of them actually consider themselves a gamer, even despite folks that are really kind of playing very heavily within these games. So it was important to start to disambiguate that like we're kind of like couching folks within this label, but like it's loaded with a lot of meaning and what have you. And realistically, what people think about when you think about, the classic gamer, kids in the basement and whatnot, it's a very small part of the population. It's about, anywhere from 10 to 20%, depending on where we want to do the cutoff. So long and short is that we want to be mindful about, how we're talking about people that just enjoy gaming, and then likewise realize that, there are different ways in which people are interacting with the ecosystem. Again, just based upon the scale of it alone, you'd expect that there would be different ways that people are oriented and therefore different opportunities for marketers along with that.
Are there any updated demographics as far as how the split is between male, female, and the different generations as far as who's playing and, to give an audience profile?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the demos are almost always going to be 50-50, but I think, you can always find the latest at our websites, activisionblizzardmedia.com. Like, I'm a researcher first and foremost, so we spend a lot of time going out and doing these typologies. We did like a fun little interactive thing where people could kind of go out and look at the typologies or what have you. But I think ultimately, whether it's that or even across some of the research that we did on social media, you'll probably be surprised because again, I think marketers and people that work in marketing really have kind of calcified around that idea that this is just the domain of a very specific group of people. But then when you kind of get over that first hump and recognize that, again, if you have a app that is a game on your phone, we consider you part of the gaming population because you are indeed playing games, it starts to kind of make a little bit more sense in terms of how diversified that audience is, and therefore very likely that you'll find your consumer. It's just a matter of finding the right experiences to reach them, and that's where myself and my team help folks.
All right, I mean, you mentioned Candy Crush before. Do you know what the split is for that as far as?
So I mean, and again, this gets back to that point of finding the right experience, that something like Candy Crush is going to be much more female-based, but then if you look at something like esports, you're much more likely to find males. So, that's where that's kind of like a high-level example, but in either direction, depending on who you want to reach, again, there's an experience for it. It's just a matter of making sure that you're kind of dialed in, and therefore that also the messaging is going to resonate with that potential group.
Okay, so with that in mind, with audience, different platforms too, mobile versus using a connected device. What are the opportunities for brands in gaming, and how should they think about trying to reach these audiences in a gaming environment?
Yeah, I mean, so as noted, we really try to kind of explain these experiences, whether you want to be in, adjacent, or what have you to the game experience. And I think the important thing to reconcile with folks is that there are opportunities that are very turnkey, that are as simple as running video ads or what have you. And again, that seems kind of basic, and video ads more specifically in a game like Candy Crush. And that seems pretty, basic, but, it's important to reconcile that one, it's easy to do because you can use a lot of your assets as they exist now, or if they're not quite fit, we can help with that. But then above and beyond that, you can start to learn a lot about how consumers are oriented around that media, even from that example. And by that, what I mean is, again, when you're playing a game, and for those of you that play, either on a console or PC, at a mobile device or what have you, that whole concept of second screen or whatnot doesn't happen, right? When you're playing a game, you're locked in. So that's meaningful in terms of how we present the ads to folks, how folks are tuned into it, how their memory and attention is related to it. And again, these are all positives, but then you want to make sure that, again, your message is very tuned into an audience where indeed they might be locked in. And then again, from there, whether you're talking about broader IP sponsorship, corporate alliances, esports, streaming, or what have you, again, all of these are going to be a little bit different, but all with that same kernel of understanding how folks are oriented towards this media. And again, generally what value are they trying to get out of it? Because again, people come to gaming fundamentally to solve for some fairly basic needs in terms of wanting to be entertained or connect socially.
We've heard even just the first few panels today, some activations that are taking place in Roblox, et cetera. Are there any examples of mistaken applications or executions in this space, where people are doing it wrong? You just mentioned people are in the game because they want to play the game. They're passionate about gaming itself or about the particular game.
I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to start to point fingers where people are doing it wrong. But what I will say is that, again, when we talk about say Roblox and things like that, have become very popular for marketers because again, it's we can make good on our metaverse strategy, but it's just gaming, right? The big thing that we're trying to land with folks is yes, there's an interesting conversation to be had about metaverse. Yes, it's important for you to look at the gaming sector if you are interested in it, because again, gaming has a history of some 50 years where people are interacting in virtual worlds. But all the more meaningful experiences that exist in the metaverse that exist now are basically just gaming. So on the one hand, it's less that, people are doing it wrong so much as like, let's just be clear what we're talking about, what we're doing. And yes, these can prep for that future world, but realistically, you're kind of already in that ecosystem. And then I would ask or have these marketers start to think about how can they expand out from that strategy? Because again, that's a big part of the gaming ecosystem. It's not the only part, as noted. There's a lot out there and a lot of potential surface area.
Okay, and you are the measurement guy at Activision Blizzard. Can you just tell us a little bit about how does Activision Blizzard measure the impact of these type of activations in games?
Yeah, so we really try to connect up and make sure that, again, if we're talking about vanity metrics or what have you, we're not doing our job, right? So fundamentally in the same way that you'd expect ROI-based measurement, whether it's brand impact or cases, cans, and bottles of products sold or what have you from any other ultra-premium, mobile app or from anything from sports sponsorships or what have you, we offer those same types of services because we understand that folks are, again, just starting to try to orient themselves towards this ecosystem more generally, and the burden is on us to kind of demonstrate that you're going to get positive ROI out of it. Now, the good news is that from what I've seen throughout, doing a lot of studies on various platforms and various different, ways in which to interact with the ecosystem, it does tend to be very effective for brands, again, based upon that fact that we were talking about before, that people are really locked into it. So I think realistically, it's that, we get to the point where, we don't want folks entering this ecosystem because it's kind of buzzy and you're going to kind of go in with kind of a test budget or what have you. We fundamentally believe that gaming should be a concrete part of your marketing plan moving forward, right? Like whether you're interested in the metaverse or not, or interested in virtual worlds more generally, and the way to do that and the way that we can make sure that we build that level of trust with our customers is to make sure they're getting top tier results. And we want to make sure that we're measuring the things that are meaningful for brands.
All right, now we're a little bit over, but I do want to give you an opportunity to kind of weigh in on next year. So just predictions for 2023. You can or don't have to mention the metaverse if you don't want to.
Well, so, and that's the thing, right? So I think the easy thing would be like, I'll talk about the metaverse. But like, honestly, like it's just kind of go what it's been doing for a while. And again, realistically, 95% of what you're going to hear is in gaming. What I would focus on is that there's going to be an increased bleed between various sectors of entertainment, right? So even if you're not particularly interested in gaming per se, one way or another, you are probably going to come across gaming IP. Like, has anyone like seen or like any trailers or interested in like The Last of Us on HBO Max? Anyone? Right? Okay. Anybody seen the trailer for Super Mario Bros. Movie? That few? How did you miss it? So again, like what we're finding is
it's so ubiquitous. It's just part of the everyday experience.
I mean, yeah, like who's Mario? What? So what my overall point is that you see some of the streaming entities starting to get in gaming, and Netflix has made a lot of headlines where they're buying out studios and what have you. But then also Hollywood is borrowing a lot from IP that gaming has, and now really kind of keeping true to the storytelling within those. So again, one of these things that's really going to start kicking off next year, because I think those are going to be two of the exemplar projects, is whether you like it or not, you're going to come across the gaming ecosystem. It's just kind of a matter of like, do you want to kind of engage with it directly or kind of through some of these indirect paths, whether it's through streaming or movies or what have you.
All right, well, that's all the time we have. Jonathan Stringfield from Activision Blizzard, thank you so much for joining us today.